From Idaho's News Channel 7, this is Viewpoint.
And welcome to Viewpoint. I'm Doug Petcash. We're getting back into the heat of the political season. Before we know it, the November general election will be here, Tuesday, November 8th. That being said, the next two Viewpoints are focusing on one of the big races here in Idaho, the race for U.S. Senate between longtime Republican Senator Mike Crapo and his Democratic challenger David Roth. Next week, Mr. Roth will be my guest. We'll get to know him, his priorities, and his stances on the big issues affecting the country and Idaho. Today, Senator Crapo is up first. He is running for his fifth term in the U.S. Senate. Senator Crapo is the top Republican on the Senate Finance Committee and is the ranking member and former chairman of the Senate Banking Committee. Before winning his first election to the Senate in 1998, Crapo served 6 years in the U.S. House of Representatives, representing Idaho's 2nd District, and 8 years in the Idaho State Senate. I recently sat down with the Republican incumbent for a wide-ranging interview. We talked about his priorities, plus the economy and inflation, abortion rights, health care for veterans, and why he voted no on a few major bills recently. I started the interview by asking him why he's running for a fifth term.
Well, you know, America is facing incredible challenges right now, and I've been in the middle of the fights that we've been having back and forth to try to get us onto the right path. Most people in America today think we're on the wrong path, about 80% of them. And I'm running because I believe I can make a difference.
Now, I have a question for you, that being said, from my dad. My dad's a big supporter of term limits.
Yes.
What do you think about term limits?
Well, I believe that term limits are involved with elections. People get to make a choice every election cycle as to whether they want those who are serving in Congress or in whatever position to continue serving.
So what do you think is the biggest challenge right now facing Americans and Idahoans in particular?
You know, I usually answer that question by saying it's the national debt. And in a broad sense, that's probably still true because our debt, as you know, is now racing way past $30 trillion. And that impacts every aspect of our lives here in America, whether it's from our national defense to our economy, our strength in our economy, jobs, and so forth. But today we're facing even greater threats, and it's kind of hard to specify a specific answer to that because right now, I think we are facing a phenomenal threat to our Constitution and to the rule of law in America, which is the underpinning of the strength of America. What I mean by that is, we have literally open borders right now with over 2 million people crossing the border illegally this year, a record. And that brings with it all of the dangers and troubles, like the fentanyl crisis that we are facing, the lawlessness that we are facing. On top of that, we have a dynamic in America right now that rejects the rule of law. There are efforts to defund the police. There are efforts to create sanctuary cities where those who have brought cartel activity or other illegal activity, fentanyl and drugs into the country, are given sanctuary. And on top of that, we are seeing just incredible economic damage being done by the administration's policies across the board. Inflation at record 40-year highs, taxes going up, unemployment raging, people losing the spending power that they have because of the different kinds of pressures we face. And on an international level, we see phenomenal failure on our part to remain competitive against nations that are antithetical to our interests, like China and others. And so it comes together as a worry for me about the rejection of the rule of law, a lack of commitment to the Constitution, and then that unfettered spending that is driving the national debt.
And the other side would argue that the threat to the Constitution is the way former President Trump has handled the election and his claims of election fraud and trying to remain in office.
I reject those claims. The fact is that we had a very powerful election. More people voted in the last election than in, I think, any previous election. And the reality is that our system worked. The people across this country have had the benefit of states who run the elections, who were focused very aggressively on making sure that they had the opportunity to vote in the middle of the crisis of the pandemic. And the reality is not that people don't have the right to vote or the opportunity to vote, but that there are efforts to try to actually have the federal government do what it's doing so much, and that is take control even of our election system. The last bill that we've successfully rejected on the floor of the Senate dealing with elections would have, if it had passed, federalized the elections. It would have mandated unsupervised drop boxes and prohibited states from checking IDs with regard to mail-in ballots. I mean, the notion that we don't have a solid, safe election system is simply not true.
Do you believe that the last election was legitimate and that President Biden is the president?
I do believe President Biden is the president. I also believe there was a lot of election fraud in the last election, but getting to the point I just made, we have states that run the elections, and every state certified its election results in accordance with law. And that gets back to my first part of my answer. We need to respect the rule of law and respect the role of states in controlling those elections.
I want to get to a big topic that's in the news right here, and Idaho is in the spotlight for it, and that is abortion. First of all, why do you support the Supreme Court's decision overturning the federal abortion protections under Roe v. Wade?
You know, it gets right back to what I've been talking about, and that is states' rights. The Supreme Court ruled that the control over the issue of abortion is a state issue. It didn't say abortions were legal or illegal. It said that states get to make that decision. And I think that's what our Constitution requires.
And what do you think then of the DOJ challenging Idaho's very strict new law, abortion ban, the trigger law, and the DOJ getting involved in challenging that? And you know, so many states have also weighed in and are watching this closely.
Well, once again, states' rights. This is an effort by the Department of Justice to use a federal law to say that states don't have the right to make the decision about abortion. And frankly, this administration is trying to do that in many other areas. And again, I believe states have the right to make this decision, and the federal government should not be coming up with some federal law and say, well, this federal law takes control of this issue back to the federal government.
Even if it is a, as some would argue, vaguely written law that puts doctors in a predicament?
Well, now, when you get into the substance of the law, once again, that's being challenged in Idaho under state law. And the state will decide whether those objections to the law are valid objections.
You know, doctors have argued that it's too vague, in particular when it comes to the health of the mother. In situations like ectopic pregnancies, partial miscarriages. They feel like, what do we do? You know, how do we make that life-saving decision, possibly facing a felony for this? Do you have concerns about the way the law is written in that regard? And I realize you're on the federal level and this is a state thing, but I'd like your opinion on that.
I believe that our laws, whether they're state or federal laws, should have clarity for people, and that the understanding of what the law requires and what it prohibits should be very clear. And so I have no problem with, if there is a successful challenge on that basis, I have no problem with requiring that we have clarity in the law. That being said, again, I come down to, you know, my position for historically and forever up until now has been that there should be an exception for the life of the mother. And you know, if your question is, do we define that clearly? Yes, I do think we need to define that clearly so that doctors and others know very well what it means and what can be and cannot be conducted in the state of Idaho.
We're going to take a short break, and when we come back, my one-on-one interview with Senator Mike Crapo continues with his viewpoint and a big vote on inflation and the economy. And welcome back to Viewpoint. On August 16th, President Biden signed the Inflation Reduction Act into law. The Democrats' major climate change, health care, and tax bill passed along party lines 50-50, with Vice President Kamala Harris casting the tie-breaking vote. During my one-on-one interview with Senator Mike Crapo, I asked why he voted no, along with all of the Senate Republicans, on the Inflation Reduction Act.
Where should I start? Let me tell you what's in the Inflation Reduction Act. First of all, there's not inflation reduction in the Inflation Reduction Act. That was a complete false description of the bill, which is not unusual in Congress. The reality, and by the way, that's been studied by the Joint Tax Committee and by Penn Wharton and others, and they've concluded that it has essentially no impact on inflation. The reason is what's in the bill. What's in the bill is, yet again, another $500 billion of spending, which will drive inflation. $321 billion, I think it is, or $37 billion of new taxes, which if we can get into it more deeply, I'd love to, the burden of those taxes will fall most heavily on people making less than $400, and frankly, most heavily on people making less than $200,000. It also has an interruption of our supply chain. It will significantly impact our manufacturing industries in the United States. And one of the things you've probably heard me talking about a lot, it supersizes the IRS. It's got $80 billion for the IRS. And now, what does that mean? Let's get some clarity to that. That is 5 times the annual budget of the IRS. It will allow them to hire 87,000 new auditors, and that will make the IRS larger than the Pentagon, the FBI, the State Department, and the Border Patrol combined. This will create a super agency, and we're fighting with the administration right now. They say, well, we're only going to audit rich cheats. The reality is they need $200 billion of audit income in order to meet their targets to spend that $500 billion. And the bottom line here is that they can't get that from people making over $400,000.
So your concern is that they'll be
That's right.
going after and auditing people who make a lot less.
The Joint Tax Commission has made it very clear that they cannot get that $200 billion. And CBO actually scored the bill on that basis. Without auditing people under that level. And I actually brought an amendment while this bill was being debated that said, okay, if you really aren't going to audit people under $400,000, then let's put that in the bill. Let's just say that you can't use this money to audit people under $400,000. And guess what? Every single Democrat voted against that amendment.
So what should be done, in your opinion, to combat inflation? We are seeing gas prices come down, but grocery prices are still way up, and so many other things too. What can we do?
Well, first of all, yes, gas prices have come down about 30, 40, 50 cents, but they're still around $5 a gallon, almost double and historically high levels. And secondly, inflation remains at 40 years highs. So what can we do? What we can do is follow good supply side spending. Instead of taxing the manufacturing industry aggressively so that we drive more supply chain interruptions, we need to incentivize the application of capital in the United States for production. That generates jobs. That generates a strong infrastructure in our country. And that's the kind of thing on the supply side that will help address inflation. The other thing we can do is to stop spending as though there was no end to it. As I said, this bill had an additional $500 billion of spending, but previous to that, this administration in the last couple of years started out their plan with a $1.9 trillion spending bill, totally debt financed. What we've got to do is to stop spending so much, and frankly, we should stop spending anything that is not offset in the budget. And we need to increase our focus on the proper kinds of expenditures that we do, like our infrastructure spending and our supply side spending, and stop taxing the very functions in our economy that need to be allowed to flower and make our economy stronger.
Is it fair for Republicans to blame the Biden administration for inflation when it's a global problem when you look at supply chain issues, supply and demand?
It's absolutely fair. And I'll go back to the $1.9 trillion that they did in the first quarter of this last administration. And that is $1.9 trillion of new cash just pushed into the economy after the previous Congress had put trillions of dollars in to stabilize our economy in the pandemic. And my point there is this. We told them at the time when they were trying to pass this bill that it would drive inflation and push it way out of control. And in fact, Some of their own leading official or experts on their side told them the same thing. But they did it anyway, and the spending and, frankly, the taxing that I've talked about is what is driving the inflation in the United States. Now, to say it's the only factor, no, it's not the only factor, but it is the biggest factor that we are facing in the United States in terms of inflation.
But we are affected by global issues, correct?
Yeah, we are, and I'm not saying that we aren't, but the fact is that it has been made much worse than everything else. Let's take gas prices, for example. The president has literally depressed our production capacity in oil and gas and stopped the permitting on federal lands and offshores. And we went from a position of being energy independent and actually supplying Europe with some of their needs to help counterbalance Russia's pressure on them, to being a nation that is energy dependent on gasoline prices. And this was all happening far before Putin invaded Ukraine.
A large chunk of the funding of the, excuse me, I just lost my train of thought with the name of the bill, but the Inflation Reduction Act goes towards climate change. What's your take on climate change and what should be done about it?
I don't disagree with the focus on trying to address climate change. Republicans all agree that we need to address it, but we need to address it in a smart way. First of all, this bill picks winners and losers, and it picks, frankly, the most powerful place that it makes its focus is trying to move away from oil and gas, once again, reducing the production of oil and gas in the United States, and focusing on electricity. They don't acknowledge that electricity requires natural gas to produce. But the fact is that what this bill does is pick winners and losers. I have legislation that addresses this very issue. It is technology neutral support for new sources of alternate energy. It also allows oil and gas to continue to receive support and incentives for production of oil and gas. And what we need to do is exactly that. We need to have a balanced, technology neutral approach to encouraging research and development of new alternative energy sources, and we need to help those new alternative energy sources get market penetration. But we should not be choosing which ones of those alternative energy sources are the ones who will get all of the federal money for support.
We'll take one more break. Up next, Senator Crapo on veterans issues and his focus moving forward if he wins re-election. President Biden signed the PACT Act into law on August 9th. The law expands health care for U.S. veterans exposed to toxic burn pits while serving our country. Senator Mike Crapo was one of 11 Republicans to vote against the bill. He explained why, even though he supports the veterans portions of the act, he couldn't vote for the overall bill.
Well, first of all, toxic burn pits is something where in the PACT Act, one of the key elements of it was a toxic burn pits bill, which was my bill. I introduced that legislation. I also co-sponsored most of the rest of the pieces that moved into the bill to provide support for our veterans. And I would gladly have supported it had the Democrats not done what I was just talking about. They put into the PACT Act a provision that, it's a budget gimmick, if you will, that opened up a hole in our budget process of around $380 billion. And what I mean by that is, unrelated to veterans spending, it created a hole in the budget so that the Appropriations Committee can spend about another $380 billion without offsetting it under our pay-go rules in the budget, which means this turned from a veterans support bill into a huge piggy bank, if you will, for the Appropriations Committee to continue to blow out spending over the next few, well, as many years as they choose to take to roll out that next $380 billion. So I voted no. I voted on an amendment that said, let's take out that budget gimmick, which was rejected by the majority. And so many of us said, look, we support our veterans. I support our veterans. My record here with veterans is unexcelled, and I continue to support our veterans. But to just blow $380 billion of more spending into the system is not the way we should do it.
I'm curious because it did ultimately end up passing 86-11,
Right.
meaning 36 of your Republican colleagues voted for it as well. Could you have looked at it as, a compromise in the sense that the Democrats got something that they wanted, you got what you wanted in terms of those 3 or 4 provisions that you either co-sponsored or introduced yourself, and then the veterans get what they needed? Could you look at it that way?
I guess you could look at it that way, and I assume that that may be the way that some of my colleagues looked at it. I also believe there were a lot of people who just didn't want to answer the question that you just asked me and say, well, why did you vote against this critical veterans bill? But the bottom line is, I don't think that's the right way to look at it. I just don't think that you could say that a $380 billion new expenditure is the way that we should compromise to deal with protecting our budget. And that $380 billion, pumping another $380 billion into our economy is going to exacerbate every one of those problems I just talked to you about. And it's going to hurt not just the veterans, it's going to hurt everybody in America, and it's going to make us less competitive globally. That is not a good compromise.
Can you explain the vote about the $35 per month cap on insulin? Not for the veterans part of it, but for in general, why you voted no on that?
Okay, so first of all, let me say again, I have a bill on the Finance Committee on which I sit deals with Medicare. I have a bill to deal with prescription drug pricing that has bipartisan broad support, which does have a $35 cap on insulin prices. It also uses a bipartisan approach to trying to depress the growth of prescription drug prices in other areas. But what it doesn't have, and the reason I voted against the bill, is this bill wasn't just a $35 cap on insulin. It was a federal takeover of all prescription drug pricing. It was a price-fixing scheme for drug pricing. And my colleagues on the Democrat side say, oh, no, this isn't price fixing. Well, it is. And there is no case in which I believe that the federal government should get engaged in price fixing. And so that's the reason I voted against the bill.
If you win again in November, what's the first focus for you?
Well, it'll continue to be the focus that I'm now focusing on. And as you might guess, it will be to control the spending, stop the unoffset spending in the federal government and reduce that. And secondly, to grow the economy. You might recall I was a member of the Bowles-Simpson Commission years ago, which was tasked by President Obama to figure out how to deal with our crisis, our economic and fiscal crisis. There's 2 pieces of that broadly. One is control the spending, and the other is to grow the economy, because that generates greater revenue to help control the federal government's excesses. And that's the 2 things I would do. That's focusing on our tax reform and making our economy stronger for all people, more jobs, higher wages, better benefits, better returns on their investment for people who have a pension plan or a 401k, and helping people heal up economically, as well as helping the federal government heal up economically.
And again, my guest next week here on Viewpoint will be Senator Crapo's Democratic challenger in the November general election, David Roth. The general election coming up on Tuesday, November 8th. That's all of our time for this week's Viewpoint. Thank you so much for watching. I'm Doug Petcash. I'll see you tonight for the Sunday news at 10 and right back here next Sunday morning for another Viewpoint.